29th Sunday in Ordinary Time, Te rā tapurua te kau, mō iwa o he wā noa, and it is Mark and a little bit of a family dispute, which we'll come to, or at least a bit of entitlement, I think, that we'll come to in a moment. But first, welcome to a familiar face from Hull in the UK. Nice to have you, Steve. Welcome, Natalie. Welcome, John. All familiar faces and all ready to break open this quite odd passage. John, you have some background to help us.
A little bit of background, yes. And just to put the passage in context, the passage follows Jesus' third prediction about his death. And Jesus has just said that the Son of Man will be handed over to the chief priests and the scribes. They'll condemn him to death. Then they'll hand him over to the Gentiles who mock him, spit on him, flog him, kill him, and after 3 days he'll rise again. And it's met by stunning misunderstanding by the disciples, or at least a tone deafness, just as the other two predictions were. And so here we come to James and John, who, after hearing that, think only about their own status and greatness by asking for an honoured place beside Jesus in the kingdom of God. Then, of course, Jesus says, can you drink the cup I will drink or be baptized with the baptism that I'm being baptized with? And he predicts that their suffering and death will be similar to his. Anyway, their request is embarrassing. The other disciples are furious. Maybe they'd thought of asking Jesus the same favour. And their reaction is also, it's less than becoming. Jesus sits them all down, tells them that the great ones in the kingdom will be those who serve others. And only at the end of the gospel, when the disciples view Jesus in the light of the cross, they realise that they have to take up their own cross to be truly a disciple of Jesus. Discipleship is about following and serving, and often sacrificial serving. Mark wants us to know that you can't understand Jesus without understanding the suffering he went through as a ransom for many. And just a tiny second point, Mark wrote to a community that was in turmoil. Was being persecuted by Jews and by Gentile Romans. And there were divisions within the community from people assuming positions of power, of authority. And this may have led Mark to include this passage about James and John. And here we find Jesus saying that greatness comes through serving and being prepared to follow him to the place of the cross. And the whole section is followed by the wonderful healing of the blind Bartimaeus, who becomes a foil for Jesus' disciples. He immediately, without question, follows Jesus with his eyes wide open.
Thank you, John. Fairly meaty little background. Lots for us to chew on. Let's see what we find challenging first of all. Steve, what's challenging when you read this?
First of all, I think that Jesus really means what he says, which is quite a challenge to me. This is almost a repeat of a similar episode just a few verses back, when Jesus picks up a young child and holds it and sort of says, he really wants to be great, needs to be a servant and a child of all. So Jesus is definitely saying that the way he is approaching everything is going to be contrary to the way the world has things. And for me, the challenge is, how do I deal with the behavior that I see in both my own life and in the church, which mirrors that of James and John, and try to say, now, how do we see this as being good in the world, or how do we see changing things being different? Because for me, it's so tempting to slip into, gosh, you've done well, you've done really well, you've got a bigger church, you've got more money coming in, you've got this, that, and the other. Whereas I think Jesus is saying, no, that's not the way we're to be. We're not to be taking things from the world and seeing how we can live, but actually we are meant to be influencing, salting and being yeast within the world that we come into. So I was reminded of the psalm, mercy and truth are met together, righteousness and peace have kissed each other, in the sense that rather than just saying, I want to be right and I want to be true because I've got it all together, I'm saying, actually, where is mercy? And where is peace in all of this? So that, to me, is a real challenge.
Yes, you could call it that indeed. Natalie, challenge.
I actually like right at the bottom, Jesus sort of is quoting what one of the prophets said when Israel wanted a king. So he's going back. Don't you realize that this isn't how the kingdom of God works? You know that among the Gentiles, those that recognize them as rulers lord it over them. You know, are you asking your brothers to lord over each other? It's the hierarchy thing yet again continually coming up. And it is a challenge to us because we're hierarchically governed. And yet, if we look at the world, look at the things that good friends do, there is no hierarchy. I mean, we even make families hierarchies. So it's trying to break the secular and conform to the kingdom of God.
And as four of us are clergy on this occasion, it's worth remembering that clergy can very easily slip into that hierarchical way of seeing the world. So thank you. You've really put that word out there. It's a risky one. Let's ask you, John, after your input. Now, where's your challenge?
Yes, in seeing what suffering I need to make in the service of Jesus and trying to explain to children, as I'm in a school of kids, how attractive is the Christian gospel when it does talk about a lot of suffering. When you first come into our chapel, first kids, they come to the chapel, there's a big, big, big window, and there's a picture of Jesus holding a child, like Stephen was talking about, and it's from the King James version of the Bible. In big letters, it said, "Suffer little children to come unto me." And of course, the kids look at this and think, oh, what's this about? So suffering isn't a great thing at school to hear about, but we'd certainly tell them that following Jesus is about serving others and their needs. So the whole challenge for me is around the whole idea of suffering.
Thanks, John. And it's an awful word because it's undergone something of a semantic shift. And yes, you're right. So that in itself is a challenge. And as you say, thank you for that. Well, we're in a dark place for a moment. So, Steve, can I ask you to begin to present us some good news? And we recognise that you have unstable internet over in England, so anything could happen.
Sure. I guess for me, the good news is in the last verse, and principally that single word in my version, which says "for many." The ransom that Jesus paid, and I'm not going to go into what ransom might mean, but it's something that it's not just a deal, whether grubby or noble, made on my behalf. This is something universal, cosmic, and huge, which is for all people. And so what Jesus is going to do and only can do on his own is for all people. And this isn't easy to understand. John just said how the disciples have had the third account of Jesus saying what's going to happen. And they didn't understand it at that point then. And the church hasn't really understood it later on. And as we go through life, we still see the church reacting very much as the disciples did with we want to come back to power politics. Haven't they done well? They're doing really well. But in fact, the good news is it's all grace. Jesus on his own has done what the church and the disciples are unable to do. And how are we able to accept it?
Yes, indeed, and thank you for bringing that word grace into the heart of this passage, because it's almost a lens through which we can see Jesus' response, and he's actually quite gracious to the really rather unpleasant at this moment disciples, but Jesus doesn't negatize them, if that's a word. Let's ask you, John, your turn to tell us where you'll find some good news.
Well, Jesus was patient with the disciples. He knew they were weak, but he loved them anyway. And it seemed their calling wasn't because they were talented, but keen. And Jesus must have seen in them what they might become. And maybe it's the same with us. We have great potential, but the greatness of that potential might only come to fruition in the Good Friday places of suffering. So Jesus sees potential in us. That's what I reckon is good.
It's heartwarming. Natalie?
When they say, yes, we're able to take the baptism and to drink the cup, and then Jesus says, yes, you will. So he's sort of not denying them that. He's saying, actually, you will, and you will do it. You'll be able to do it. I think that's very heartwarming, because he could have said, no, it's all too hard. You're not going to be able to do it. But he actually says, you will, and you'll be able to do it. and to the glory of the kingdom too. The martyrdom of so many of our saints has inspired people to engage in trials and to not be afraid, because we can all do it through Christ.
Thank you for that, because I've always found that quite a difficult part of that interchange. And yes, it is. It's edifying to use that word again. Just putting trust in the people that God calls. So maybe that takes us a little bit into a so what. I'm going to ask you, John, so what, and especially in your context with younger people.
Well, there are two kingdoms at work in Mark's gospel. There's the kingdom of the Romans, the Gentiles, and then there's God's kingdom. And in the one kingdom, greatness lies in popularity and the number of people you can control. But in the kingdom of Jesus, greatness obviously isn't found in occupying the seats of honor, but in serving other people.
And the contrast of those kingdoms is very, it seems to me, relevant and pertinent in our world still. So yeah, thank you for putting that so clearly. Natalie, for you, so what?
I think that the so what is the fact that we are flawed, we are incredibly selfish, but we will be given the strength at the time to deal with whatever we're given. And as Steve said, for the Son of Man came not to be served but to serve, and to give his life for many. So that's sort of our job as well.
And that's a great consistency with your good news as well, affirming us, picking us up. You lift us up, as we will sometimes sing. All right, so a final word, Steve, from you. Where do you apply all this? Where do you find so what in this little exchange?
Yeah, so what? I think I just asked myself, what am I ransomed from and what am I ransomed for? And would it actually make a difference to the way I live publicly, and more importantly, how I think privately, if I actually realised that Jesus gave everything for me? And could I live my life as someone unconditionally loved by God?
Some weighty thoughts from a very human moment on the part of the disciples. We may all relate to it occasionally in our lives. And my three co-conversationalists, I think, also really breaking open and giving us an edifying reading of this passage. Natalie, John, Steve, thanks for joining me.